Ukraine has been a demonstration for commercial technology on steroids. Things like unmanned systems, sensors from space, the ability for cloud companies, the hyperscalers, to be able to basically keep the Ukrainian government running. We have to learn two lessons from Ukraine. One, the speed at which these things are moving. And second, low cost is going to be a very important determinant of who wins.
Michael Brown is a partner currently at Shield Capital and a visiting scholar at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Shield Capital is an early-stage venture capital firm investing in tech critical to national security, including Hawkeye 360, autonomous cyber, and many others. Michael previously has served as the director of the DIU, the Defense Innovation Unit, at the Pentagon before moving to Silicon Valley. What were things that you learned about the Chinese approach, the efficacy of them or the lack thereof, that surprised you?
How do we really make sure we're equipped to run what I've called a superpower marathon with China? If we look at the Chinese economy compared to the US, it's a lot closer than it once was, but their allies are not as strong. The Russian, North Korean, Iranian economies adds very little to what the Chinese have on their own. We need to pick the sectors where the US needs to lead. It's like fusion, synthetic biology, quantum, AI.
Do you feel that the alignment between DC and Silicon Valley is as you would like it?
It still takes 3 years to program $1 of spending for the Department of Defense. No one was even talking about defense tech 5 years from now. Now we're talking about tens of billions of dollars being put into exciting new companies. At Shield Capital, we focus on commercial technologies that have application in national security, not just military technologies, not just about munitions. And those worlds have increasing relevance for each other.
India, much like the DIU, has a program called IDEX that's trying to promote innovation. There's a link between DIU and IDEX also trying to bring startups from the two countries together. What are some success stories maybe that you've seen there?
I would really love to see more projects where we could blend the best of technologies from India in the US or Australia in the US.
It's a marathon and it's really going to be about who keeps adapting because the fight is going to be a dynamic one. Hi, and welcome to today's episode of the Great Tech Game podcast, where we bring you some of the world's most prominent big picture thinkers at the intersection of technology, geopolitics, and global affairs. And today, I'm excited to have someone with us who's traversed the private and the public sector, the innovation happening in Silicon Valley, the innovation happening at the intersection of technology and geopolitics, but has also played a big role in advancing the public sector's own acceleration in the field of technology and innovation. As I was saying, Michael, few people are able to traverse the public and private sectors seamlessly, and you're one of them. I'm especially excited that you've had the windows into both the private tech firms, of course, the government, the defense department, but also now Silicon Valley. So I'm hoping that we'll get deep into these themes with you. But before we get deeper, what I wanted to start us off with is actually for you to lay out from your perspective now an overall landscape of where the US-China tech competition today stands, the different innovation machines in some ways that the US and China have unleashed as part of this competition, and what's working well, what's not.
Yes, great. Well, a topic that we're both pretty interested in. If we look at China and its goals, they're very clear. President Xi has been very articulate about them, and it's basically displace the United States as the economic and technology superpower by the year 2049, which is the 100th year anniversary of the Communist Party really being the preeminent governing body in China. So pretty ambitious goal. We don't know whether he'll get there or not. That depends on what action we take also in
Yeah.
response. But we have two very different competing systems, one that's very top down, one that doesn't distinguish between an academic, a business, and a government sector, but thinks about those all as instruments of national power. And I'd say she and the party, the Communist Party, are very focused on bringing all those instruments of national power together to achieve that goal. We have a very different system in the US. Our innovation engines basically were put in place after World War II, the work Vannevar Bush did, where we believe very much in basic research, the government being a funder of that, primarily through universities, but also national institutions like DARPA and our national labs programs. All of that stem back to World War II or the Cold War after that. We have a very decentralized system, meaning after that research is developed, we expect the private sector to pick up key technologies and commercialize those. In China, as you know, they're very top-down system. They can direct capital and put teams together and create a much more government synergistic environment or government-led environment where that technology comes to the fore. And I think we have to be pretty realistic to say they've made incredible progress, especially in the last 2 decades, to really become a technology superpower. Now they're rivaling us in many areas, and they're ahead of us in quite a few areas. So we're so used to being on top in the US, the landscape since World War II. It's hard to imagine a world where someone else really has taken the lead in key technologies. But that's one of the concerns I have. If we don't respond to this appropriately and with enough urgency, we could find ourselves in a world where China is leading in technologies like AI or quantum or fusion, and that will be a very different competitive environment for us. It'll be a very different business climate where Chinese companies are setting the standards as they've tried to do through Huawei and 5G, and militarily as well, where we may not have our military may not have access to the latest technology. So that's why the stakes are so high.
Yeah, and I think you very eloquently put the case for why the US really needs to step up, both leverage its strengths, but also maybe expand the space between the US and China, which seems to be shrinking in recent years. But of course, that's the US objective to keep that lead wider. Now, you'd spend time in the private sector at Cementech and other corporations. Then you moved into the public sector. Tell me from your perspective over those years that you spent in the government, what were things that you learned about the Chinese approach, the efficacy of them or the lack thereof, that surprised you? What were things that maybe only once that you got into the public sector, into the US government, that you realize, oh, actually, I didn't realize the US is not getting this right, but the Chinese are?
Well, trained a bit from my academic years as an economist and spending my career in the private sector. My perspective was that there's pretty much not something that we want the government overly involved in. In fact, my first look at the Chinese investment in early stage technologies, the last thing I was thinking about was expanding jurisdiction for CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. So, meaning as a businessman and someone who is a fan of capitalism in our private sector, I was very leery about the role that government would need to play. My time in government told me that number one, China is thinking very long term, very holistically, with a sense of urgency about what they want to drive as national objectives. And if we compare them to the US system, I'd say it's pretty hard to say what our objectives are for the year 2049. We have not laid those out. So if you haven't articulated them, it's a question about whether you are headed to the right place. Second, I saw the power of what they have in bringing all instruments of national power together to achieve an objective. And that's why I think they've been as successful as they have been. I also saw how slow we are. Our systems, whether it's budgeting or planning, being designed in the Cold War to compete with a lumbering Soviet system, are not very agile to adapt to a fast-moving competitive environment. I'm not saying that the Chinese are agile and their government is moving at lightning speed, but I think we need to think about reformulating some of those systems. I'd say budgeting is probably the one that's the most in our way in terms of achieving what we need to from a technology standpoint, especially as it relates to bringing capability into the military. So all of that said to me, number one, this is a huge problem, and I'd like to be spending more of my professional career focused on this problem. How do we really make sure we're equipped to run what I've called a superpower marathon with China? It's not going to be something that's a race. The problem with the marathon, as an example, is it implies there's a winner and there's a certain finish line. It really is something that's going to be ongoing for the next few decades, where we are challenging China and they're challenging us. Are we equipped to run that superpower marathon? I'd love to see us take that more seriously and put more things in place so that we can more adequately compete.
Yeah, I think that realization that you talk about, right, that the US government and its different arms and different think tanks start to maybe, I think, come to in the middle of the last decade or, between 2015 and 2020, let's say, it seems to have gone deep into the US government, that this realization that, the Chinese have very long term goals. And one of those goals is to displace, as you were saying, the US as the preeminent tech, economic, geopolitical, military power in the world. After that realization sinks in, do you think the US, now having spent a few years in government, now before you've moved to Silicon Valley, is your assessment that the US government and the private sector have gotten most of the things right in their assessment of where China is headed and what the US needs to do? Or are there some things that you would feel that the mainstream discourse in the US is still getting wrong about China?
I think there's been a realization that this is an issue we have to focus on. I would say at the end of the Obama administration, the beginning of the Trump administration, that realization started to sink in. But in terms of how do we operationalize that, what are the mechanisms? I feel like we have a long way to go. So your previous question was, what did I realize in government? One of the things I realized is that in addition to recognize as a problem, we really need to come together on what are the right solutions. One of those, in my mind,
Yeah.
clearly is an industrial policy. If we allow the private sector to simply maximize for profit, which it's very good at. We're going to get some capabilities we want as a nation, but we might get a few more dating apps and ad targeting companies than we do companies focused on bringing fusion or quantum computing to reality. So if you think about it
Yeah.
from a national capabilities standpoint, you really need more of an industrial policy which is focused on technology. Industrial policy for many years had a bad name as we're picking winners and losers of in companies that will serve a function for our economy. If you look at previous examples like France, you'd say that hasn't worked out very well. My perspective of industrial policy is we need to pick the sectors where the US needs to lead. So those are areas like fusion, synthetic biology, quantum, AI. And what do we do to set the conditions so that those industries can win and the U.S. can have leading positions. It's such things as, are we spending enough in basic R&D? Well, that's been our strength since World War II. That's been on the decline since the 1960s in terms of the percentage of federal budget, percentage of GDP that's spent on federal R&D. Recent moves
Yeah.
that the Trump administration has made set us back a little bit further. Immigration policy is a part of that to be able to attracting the world's best talent. Leveraging the strength of having the world's best universities is a part of that. Making sure that the private sector has the right long-term incentives. Since the 1980s, the private sector has increasingly been focused on this concept of shareholder value. If we take care of the shareholders, everything else will follow. That's true in a world
Yeah.
where everyone thinks the way you do. If we're all capitalistic economies and we can trade freely with each other, that Milton Friedman and Chicago School of Thought makes a ton of sense. I was a fan of it myself. In a world where we have geopolitical rivals, peer rivals, where supply chains can be used competitively and even punitively, that world does not make sense anymore. Now we have to make sure that we have access to the key raw materials we need, whether that's rare earths or other materials, and that we have long-term incentives so that we can think about what do we need from a national capability standpoint 10 or 20 years from now. Our capital markets are not designed for that. They're designed for optimizing for the short term, not for bringing national capabilities to the fore. So some rethinking both on the government side and the private sector side, would really put us in much better position for this competition. Just one more point about government. The whole government structure that we have from a national security enterprise was designed in the Cold War. The Department of Defense constructed in 1947, the National Security Council. That was all facing, again, a lumbering Soviet system, mostly focused on a military and ideological competition. This competition is about economics and technology. And the Chinese have figured out how important those relate to each other and how important they are in the national agenda. It's not clear from our government structure or even the rhetoric of the key leaders in power in Washington that that is seen as the central battleground in this competition with China. And therefore, do we have the right structures in place to be able to address those challenges?
Yeah, I think that industrial policy piece that you talk about, right? I think is critical. It's something that the U.S. in many ways had forgotten or had stopped thinking about as a strategy, right? Market oriented forces, pure market oriented forces, let's say, had taken over in the last 30, 40 years at least. Whereas the Chinese have been thinking about it differently, have been acting differently. As you mentioned, that they have a much more top down, state oriented approach on where they want to focus. Um, but in many ways, the natural question that comes up, right, Michael, is you are highlighting now a bigger role for the government to direct the sectors in which the private sector should be working on. You want to let, I'm assuming, if I was to go sort of presume the next step is let the winners be determined by the market, but the sectors be directed in some ways, priority sectors be determined by the government in line with the geopolitical battle that you're facing with China and what tech areas or arenas the US also considers critical in that battle. Do you run the risk of becoming more and more like the China that you are trying to fight in
I
that
don't I don't
path?
think so. I think the one clarification I would make to the way you frame this is I'm not asking for the government to lead the sectors or direct the sectors. I'm asking for the government to set the conditions so that these sectors would attract more investment and be thinking about incentives for the private sector to be able to come in and commercialize the technology that comes from the efforts in those sectors. So the government role is really about thinking about factors of production. I need to make sure that to the extent I need capital, are there incentives for capital to come in? Let's take a quick example. So if I'm thinking about fusion or uh, quantum computing a little bit closer to reality, so private sector has come in. You could argue whether that's fast enough. On fusion, not so much. An equally critical or more critical technology is a factor of production. Energy is critical. So
Yeah.
the where the government can play a role is for these risky and capital intensive sectors. The government can help prove the maturity of the technology. That's a traditional role that government has played. But if we look at again the amount of R&D dollars that the government's putting to work, it's a fraction of what it was in the 1960s. To put a number on that, in the 1960s we spent 2% of GDP, so think about how much money that would be today. 2% times a $27 trillion economy would be 500 billion. We're spending less than half of that today. In fact, the number today is 0.6% of GDP being spent on federally funded R&D. So the question is that the profile of an economy that's focused on its future and developing the technologies for the next 20, 30, 40 years, which will keep the US ahead? I would argue that that investment that was made in the space race, the first space race of the 1960s, and right after that, that brought the development of the semiconductor industry, and following that, advanced computing, networking technology, storage technology, that really laid the groundwork for the internet. And of course, the government was involved in developing that through DARPA in the 1960s. Those kind of investments lead to kind of untold benefits in terms of technology that can be commercialized that the private sector runs with and creates incredible economic benefits. That's the reason why 40% of the S&P 500 market cap today is tech. it's played such a critical role in our economy. So are we making the investments today? Where's the seed corn that will make sure that in 2030, 2040, 2050, the US is still leading in those next technologies, whether that's AI, synthetic bio, quantum, or whatever they might be. That's the kind of approach we need to have. So attracting the right capital, making sure there's enough basic R&D, which is a role really only the government could do. No individual company or financial actor can do that. Immigration, are we attracting the right talent? Do we have the universities where that research can take place? The health of our institutions like national labs, DARPA, IARPA, et cetera, they need to be vibrant. Those what I call setting the conditions to make sure that from that the right technologies get commercialized, and then the private sector comes in and we see, as you indicated, who are the winners. Yes, let the marketplace decide that. The government should not be picking winners and losers among the companies.
Yeah, and I think that's critical. Both of us have are also wearing VC hats, and when you talk about the R&D piece in the 1960s, 2% being spent by the public sector. I've seen charts that show that basically the share of the private sector in R&D in the US versus the public sector has basically flipped, right, in the last
Right,
60 years or so, where the government was maybe doing about 70 odd percent of the total R&D in the US in, let's say, the 1960s. Today, it's the private sector that's doing 70-ish percent. The
right.
government's share has come down significantly, which, as you point out, is, let's say, maybe less than 1% of GDP. So it's clear that the private sector is doing a bulk of the R&D. I would say, while I don't know the exact numbers, I'm assuming that some of the larger tech firms are doing the bulk of that private sector R&D as well,
Right.
Google's and the Metas of the world. So the question really becomes now: is it true that the government needs to get back to that 70% type share,
Yeah,
or
not,
are we
not
now in a different world altogether where the private sector will actually be the biggest contributor of R&D dollars?
we're in a different world, but I'm not suggesting that the government needs to become 70% of R&D. What I am suggesting is that because it's a good thing that the business community is doing a lot more R&D, that tends to be more
Yeah,
applied than basic research. But I am suggesting that the government needs to keep, as a proportion of the economy, a certain percent focused on basic research. That's where basic research is done. So again, that's shifted from 2% in the 1960s now to 0.6. Half of that now is being spent on health. So if we went back to the 1960s, that whole 2% was being spent on national security oriented um, activities. Now half of it's being spent on health. I think after the pandemic, no one would argue with that. We want a certain amount spent on health, national institutes of health, et cetera. But for that portion that's now national security to have gone from 2% to now 0.3%, we've cut
3%.
that too deep. So I would argue that we need to be thinking more about 1 to 2% again rather than zero point 0.6. And that would mean hundreds of billions of dollars. In fact, we'd have to go from the roughly
Yeah.
180 billion we're spending to closer to 500 billion. Now, this was outlined earlier in the Frontiers Act that was a predecessor of the CHIPS Act. Even in the CHIPS Act, there was a lot of money that was being envisioned or authorized for the National Science Foundation. That money was completely cut out when the Congress came around to allocating money, and of course it went to the CHIPS Act, um, and to the tune of some 50 billion. Okay, that's a significant amount, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what we need to be spending on basic research. And if we want a semiconductor industry that's basically in the US again, that wouldn't even do it. So there's a lot of money, and that needs to be spent, and that would cause a big trade-off relative to the other government priorities because you can't keep adding to the deficit that we have today. I'm a big believer in the fact that that is a national security concern. If interest rates went higher, we're already spending more in interest payments than we do for our defense. That's classically not a good sign of a thriving economy. So that needs to be addressed as well. But it just means those trade-offs are going to be harder with the social programs that we all have come to love, where we need to be thinking that there needs to be a trade-off so that we're investing in our future 20, 30, 40 years from now, as opposed to just the current transfer payments that are being enabled by the federal government. That's some of the hard work that needs to be done.
Yeah. And as you think about that future, clearly now there are two sectors like the public sector that has gone through this realization over the last few years that it needs to up its act. And I think as proponents like you have made that case so articulately. Then of course there's Silicon Valley, which has been the engine of that innovation that has driven, I would say, U.S. technological leadership over the last several decades. So talk to us now, having been in both. What do you see as the strengths currently of the US government, the Pentagon, the Defense Department, especially when it comes to national security innovation? What do you see as its weaknesses? And on the other hand, so Michael, the future that you talk about, there are basically, I think, as I see it, two engines driving the US towards that future. One is, of course, the I would say the Defense Department, as far as national security innovation is concerned, the US government on one side, and then, of course, Silicon Valley, right, which has been the engine of tech innovation and tech leadership for the US over the last several decades. Having been in both, tell us what you see as the relative strengths of both, right? And how are they starting to complement the two, complement each other?
I think if we look at our two uh, complementary approaches, what the U.S. government is doing and what Silicon Valley is doing. I want to give credit to Ash Carter, former defense secretary from the middle of the last decade, because back in 2015, he saw that the Defense Department, which had created Silicon Valley in the late 60s and early 70s with the formation of the chip industry, he saw that Silicon Valley and the Defense Department needed to be reconnected. And he envisioned that there's going to become a time, probably sooner than he thought at that time, when the military is going to need the technologies that Silicon Valley is producing, AI, cyber tools, unmanned systems, to be the complement to what the defense industrial complex had produced, F-35s,
Yeah.
Ford class aircraft carriers, etc. So in doing that, he said, we really need some mechanisms to reconnect these two uh, ecosystems. And that's when he formed the Defense Innovation Unit, the Defense Digital Service, the Defense Innovation Unit to bring commercial technology in the military, Defense Digital Service to have some internal capability to develop software within the Department of Defense, the Defense Innovation Board, which he tapped Eric Schmidt to lead, to bring the best ideas of academia and business back to the Defense Department. So this, I think, was the beginning of a trend which now is in full swing because now you don't have to look very far in the world. Ukraine has been a demonstration for commercial technology on steroids, things like unmanned systems, things like sensors from space enabled by the satellites that SpaceX and others have launched. Um, the ability for cloud companies, the hyperscalers, to be able to basically keep the Ukrainian government running by transferring all of that data to the cloud before the Russians invaded or before the cyber attacks occurred at the very beginning of the war. So commercial technology has really proven itself here with the Ukraine war. So it's really proving what Ash Carter had set out to do. So in the meantime, groups like Defense Innovation Unit, which I had the privilege to run, uh, have made it easier for smaller companies to approach the Defense Department and do business with the DoD. Those efforts are now being accelerated by the second Trump administration, which I'm glad to see. And Congress has been incredibly supportive of the effort by increasing the budget for DIU, which is up over 10x from the time that I led DIU. And their capitalistic economy, venture capitalists like you and me see opportunity. That's exactly what you need to have to bring in private capital. And there's been just a tremendous pouring in of capital into this sector. No one was even talking about defense tech 5 years from now. Now we're talking about tens of billions of dollars that are being put into exciting new companies. Companies like you mentioned at the outset, Hawkeye 360, Anduril, Shield AI, which is a unmanned systems company, to follow the first wave of new defense companies would be Palantir, SpaceX, um, and Anduril. And in fact, the market cap of those three companies, SpaceX, Palantir, Anduril, is now bigger than the market cap of the five defense primes. They're doing about 10% of the revenue, but they have a market cap that's bigger than Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, et cetera. So it just shows this incredible momentum where the market believes value is going to be created. And of course, that's bringing in a lot of capital to support that. All of this very good trends from the standpoint of national security, because we're now developing capabilities like those on display in Ukraine that will be complementary to the big, large defense platforms we've seen for years. We're still going to need, if we've learned anything from Ukraine, we're still going to need the big
Yeah.
defense platforms. We need the air defense systems. We need the Patriot batteries. We need F-35s. We need submarines, but we also need unmanned systems, resilient comms, more AI software, on and on. So it's Silicon Valley, which has been on the forefront of bringing those technologies to market and making those available to the military.
Yeah, the combination of high low, as people tend to put it, is what the US needs, and that's
Mhm.
where the future of warfare seems to be headed. If recent hot conflicts are any judge of where they're headed. Um, you've mentioned the defense primes.
Right.
You've mentioned the new emerging defense tech firms. You mentioned the VC firms have now really taken the defense tech sector, the def tech sector, as a key priority and is starting to pour large amounts of money. Do you worry now from the VC hat that you wear, Michael, that the defense primes uh, are gonna dominate and try and not lose their lead, so to say, so easily to these new emerging rivals now? How's that battle gonna play out?
I don't think it's so much as, yeah, I don't see it so much as a battle or competition because we need more defense capability. Historically, we've spent a lot more on defense than we are right now, even though we have now with the big beautiful bill plus defense appropriations about $1 trillion going in defense. That's still 3% of GDP. That's half of what we spent during the Reagan buildup, where we were concerned about the Soviets, and certainly a lot less than we spent in, the 1960s. So we're spending a historically low amount on defense, and even of that, only 20% is spent on things for warfighters. So the rest of it's being spent on, salaries, sustaining large defense platforms that we have in place, et cetera. So what I see is that we need both. We're not spending all that much on defense. We're not spending all that much on what we supply warfighters. That's where I would like to see growth in the defense budget on what we're actually buying to deliver to warfighters, giving our commanders more capability. And for that, we need the high-low mix. You talked about it. I've talked about it as a hedge strategy. You've got to hedge what you've got with the large platforms to provide new capabilities that
Yeah,
enhance what we can do in a conflict situation. So it's not an either or. We need more from the defense primes. They're capacity constrained because historically, as I've mentioned, we have not spent that much on building things for warfighters. So we need to be spending more, and we need this new capability, and we need it yesterday. All you have to do is look at an operation like Spider's Web that the Ukrainians just successfully perpetrated to see how vulnerable we are to the new technologies. We've got to catch up and now get ahead of that. And that's going to require a tremendous amount of support from venture capitalists, these new players in the marketplace. So there's really room for everyone. What I worry about is not so much a battle between the defense primes and the new players, but whether the US government will create the consistent demand signal to be able to continue to encourage more companies, more entrepreneurs, more investors to continue to put money in this space. I see a lot of very positive signals with the fiscal year 26 defense appropriation and with the changes in how we're going to buy things, which is an emphasis on commercial first, using more other transaction authorities. So the second Trump administration is really focused on changing the acquisition process, calling for a redo of the federal acquisition regulations. Those are incredibly powerful steps and positive in terms of delivering capability to warfighters faster. The Secretary of Defense issued a directive called the Software Acquisition Pathway, which basically says we need to be buying all software, not the old way with federal acquisition regulation, but the way DIU has shown, other transaction authority, encouraging more commercial competition and being able to take the winners of those prototyping exercises directly into production. Those kind of changes are equally important as how much money
Yeah.
we're
And
spending.
other than these changes and reforms and acquisition, right, which I think, as you rightly mentioned, DIU, Unitex, all of these sort of initiatives have really helped drive Ash Carter, of course, being I would say, the visionary there that has led that, as you also mentioned, and others on our podcast have mentioned. Um, are there still other problems, big problems to be tackled other than, let's say, the acquisition reforms that you've just talked about that have been put into place?
Well, the biggest one, I'll go back to my point before about our budgeting process. So it still takes 3 years to program $1 of spending for the Department of Defense. And historically, that's been split into 1,700 line items. So while Congress has a role of strategic oversight, I would say instead of being strategic, we're micromanaging. There's
Yeah.
political reasons for that. Congress people want jobs in districts. I get that. The aircraft carrier and its supply base touches 350 of our 435 congressional districts. Okay, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out why is it so difficult to make a trade-off to do one less aircraft carrier and get 1 million drones in its place. But these are the hard questions we've got to tackle. Of course, we can spend more, and I just argued that we should be spending more as a percentage of GDP. But if you're not going to spend more, you have to make those hard trade-offs of what am I going to do with a little less of to make sure I get some of the new capability, which again has proven itself in the Middle Eastern conflicts we've just seen and what we saw in Ukraine. And cost is an important part of this. We have to learned two lessons from Ukraine. One, the speed at which these things are moving. And second, low cost is going to be a very important determinant of who wins. We can't continue to send multi-million dollar missiles up to intercept, $10,000 drones. That's not a winning formula for the taxpayer. So these have to be incorporated. And what that means is more flexibility for the Department of Defense and what they spend on, and a process that allows that money to come much
Yeah.
faster. I can't be relying on having understood 3 years from now, what am I going to need to buy in a world of software and as fast as unmanned systems are changing? That
Yeah.
doesn't
Yeah.
work. Yeah, our cycle time must be
Yeah, yeah.
improved.
No, I think that's a very important point. That's critical. Um, do you feel that the alignment between, to put it simply, DC and Silicon Valley is now pretty much there, um, as you would like it? The strategic alignment, the vision alignment.
The strategic alignment, absolutely. Now operationalizing that in terms of
What
what
you were describing, that
processes
there's still
happen underneath. And budgeting is a big part of that. But the entire planning process for the military, which includes something called the requirements process, typically done is something called the JSIDS process, which takes the task of how do I integrate a lot of priorities and make sure I have the right specification. That makes sense for an aircraft carrier where I really need to tell the suppliers what to build. It makes no sense for unmanned systems, sensors from space, AI software. We don't need the military taking a separate process to figure out what to build. The commercial market is figuring that out faster. So strategically, yes, there's a realization of the big picture concepts, high-low or hedge strategy that we talked about. The military knows it needs these new capabilities. How it goes about
is the
determining what to buy and how to buy, that needs a lot of reform.
yeah. May I ask you to reflect upon what have been the triggers of this sort of new alignment, right? Because if you go back many years at least, there was this inherent tension between Silicon Valley's vision and the national security establishment's vision of the world. Um, there were those famous Google protests against Project Maven, etc. But now there's much more
Yeah.
alignment, as you've mentioned, at least at the strategic vision level. What have been the key triggers, maybe other than Ukraine, the Ukraine war? What have been key triggers that have really led to this alignment?
Yeah, well, let's go back to Ash Carter's vision. The military is going to need more commercial tech. The military can't be successful if we just focus on large defense platforms. So we need the unmanned systems, we need the AI software, et cetera. That's coming from another place than the typical defense suppliers. How do we encourage that working together? That was Ash Carter's vision, that it would come together, and it has. Second, you have to give credit to Xi and Putin. The world is a much more dangerous place. We are now in an era of great power competition, which you could argue is probably the what the world has existed with for most of its history. We're way out of the unipolar moment that came from the end of the Cold War. So the fact that we need to be thinking more about defense technologies and the technologies have become even more dangerous, if you want to put it in that sense, in terms of their lethality. Third, the development of these commercial technologies. You couldn't have said, 5 or 8 years ago that there it was the capacity to put these sensors in space, that we had the AI technology to control these unmanned systems. So the level of technology development has enabled their usefulness in warfare. AI is a perfect example of that. Letting machines do some of the, work of understandings of the satellite imagery, what Project Maven has done to understand what's happening with those pixels rather than having analysts sit for hours analyzing those pictures,
Yeah.
um, to be able to do targeting automatically. So these technology developments have also happened in the last decade, have been a key part of that. And then let's add the venture capital, the money that's just flowed to support new entrepreneurs, new ideas in these technologies. I can't tell you, and you're probably the same as me, the number of companies we're seeing that are bringing fascinating new technologies to bear that will have military applications. At Shield Capital, we focus on commercial technologies that have application in national security, not just military technologies, not just about munitions. And those worlds have increasing relevance for each other. So these are some of the trends that have put us to the position we're in today, which is a very fortunate one from the standpoint of national
And are there
security.
certain mechanisms between, let's say, the U.S. government and this Silicon Valley ecosystem, right? That Shield is also an active part of now, that is helping increase this, or let's say, like make the alignment more efficient or more, let's say, two-way. Are there certain mechanisms that are working well there?
Well, I think the mechanism that's working well is the realization that the military needs these technologies, and there's more of a mindset, if you watch how the military is experimenting with these technologies, to get feedback directly from the warfighter. So our historical process would have been very detached. The people who are acquiring the system, the people who are specifying what the requirements are, and the warfighter. Those are really being brought together, especially through an experimentation and prototyping process, because now the technology is available as soon as I think about the need, as opposed to I might have an idea that now I need to take from the drawing board to a defense prime to get it to develop it, and then we can start testing. And I mean, that's a very long process. The F-35 is 20 years in design. So how am I going to get something current if I try and design it 20 years before? So that's all happening now on a much faster, basically Silicon Valley style approach, which was called agile development. That's all now starting to bleed into what we're doing in the military. So that's bringing a lot more alignment. The recognition of the need, the money being supplied to new entrepreneurs and companies, and this concept of let's start getting warfighter feedback and experimenting and prototyping. And that's led to entirely new companies and business models that are bringing capability as a service to the military. So the military doesn't have to buy everything. In the case of satellite imagery, what if I just buy the data? I don't need to own and operate the
Absolutely.
satellite.
And I'm also gonna go out on a limb and say that you are an example of that kind of mechanism also, right? That now the more people that move between government and Silicon Valley, right? Recently, I know that some of the folks from some of these interesting sort of fast growing defense tech firms have been uh, given roles in the army. um, of course, people like you who worked in DIU have now, let's say, moved out to Silicon Valley, and of course, that also accelerates this kind of exchange of ideas and the alignment, I would think.
That's right. We've got probably record number of veterans. I haven't seen anything quantitative on this, but I can't believe the number of vets who are now interested in starting businesses.
Yeah,
So we're seeing, the end users who've been there and felt the need saying, I can go solve that. I see that technology has progressed to the point where I can solve that in a much better fashion than maybe I had access to when I was in the military. And those people are taking those thoughts and putting them into action.
Yeah, let's now talk about the rest of the world, right? I mean, we've talked a lot about the US, to some extent China. Um, of course, you've referred to the Cold War a few different times. Um, One of the key things that I believe, looking back into history, that helps the US win against the Soviet Union, right, is allies, is friends. Um,
No question. That's our asymmetric advantage in the United States, allies and
I
partners.
like I absolutely agree with that, right? And I think given today's battle with, let's say, between the US and China, allies, friends of the US are going to be, I would say, equally important because now the Chinese threat is, in many ways, as you mentioned earlier, not just a pure military or geopolitical threat, it's also an economic tech power, maybe of a kind that maybe the Soviet Union.
It's primarily economic and
That's right.
technology based.
So, talk to me about how the defense tech space we've been talking about, the changes in the US government, acquisition, budgeting, thinking on innovation, Silicon Valley's role in that, and the alignment that we've been talking about. How does that now extend to the rest of the world, to the other allies and friends the US has around the world? What role are those countries playing, both as possible collaborators, possible markets for the products that, let's say, the Palantirs and the Maxars of the world are coming up with? How do you see that panning out now over the next few years?
I really see, as you've alluded to, that the strength with allies and partners is going to be even more critical in this competition with China. There's no corner on innovation in the US or that the US has exclusively. There's a lot of great ideas and talent from around the world, especially in our allies and partners, Japan, Australia, India, um, European allies. There's capital to be put to work in those different countries. The Europeans are now stepping up to $1 trillion more of defense spending. Um, and between the talent, the ideas, and that capital, we can be a lot stronger as a uh, allied group of democracies than the U.S. can be alone. And size is part of that. If we look at the Chinese economy, you know, compared to the U.S., it's a lot closer than it once was, even though they've not equaled our economy in dollar terms. They have in purchasing power parity, if you look at it, local currency, what can be bought. But now, if I start to add the Western allies to that, you can put together an economy that's 3 times bigger than what China has access to. Fortunately, their allies are not as strong. The Russian, North Korean, Iranian economies adds very little to what the Chinese have on their own. So it's that power that is going to be important to harness, but that requires the recognition of how important those allies are. How do you take a relationship like AUKUS and expand it and improve it and bring in more allies? How do you make sure that the best tech we have access to, we're through trading relationships and collaborative R&D relationships, um, and then we're bringing those partners together. If you talk with Admiral Paparo at INDOPACOM, that's part of his vision. Do we have that same vision globally with all our allies and partners, that we need to figure out how to support their economic development, make sure that we can interoperate if we're forced to fight together, which includes communication with each other. All of these are challenges for us, but we can be so much stronger if we pull this off than if we try and approach this on our own. And the world is very connected. It makes no sense to be isolationist and think that the US can withdraw to its borders, produce everything it needs. That is a much more dim view of a world future, and one that is a lot smaller for the US economically and technologically and militarily than one that includes collaborating with allies and partners, which again is bring us back to the beginning. That's
That's
been
right.
our traditional strength. In a competition with China, we should be relying on that even more and figuring out how do we strengthen that
So much like we were
rather
discussing
than
about
reducing it.
the DC Silicon Valley strategic alignment and the need that you mentioned about operationalizing it and the proof of the pudding ultimately being in that operationalization. Um, Let me ask you the same question now when it comes to US and its friends and allies on the collaboration on the defense tech side and operationalizing it. If the strategic vision is clear, that they should collaborate because that way they are many times, multifold times bigger than, let's say, the Chinese economic and innovation machine. what are some, I know that, for example, what are some obstacles that you feel are still to be overcome? I know India, for example, you mentioned AUKUS. India, I believe, much like the DIU, has a program called IDEX, from what I've been following from a VC
Hmm.
standpoint, that's trying to promote
Yes,
innovation. I believe there's a pipe, like a link between DIU and IDEX, also called, I believe, Intersect,
that's
right?
right. Hmm.
We're just trying to bring startups from the two countries together, and the buyers also, right? The governments also and different departments together to come see these innovations that are emerging. But what are some success stories maybe that you've seen there? What are some obstacles that still need to be overcome, or some hindrances that still are preventing that from scaling up?
Unfortunately, we don't have as many success stories as I would love to be able to tell. Some of our best success stories come from World War II, as an example, where we collaborated in the US extensively with the British to develop technologies that were important, like radar or winning the war, code breaking. We need more of those. And that's because we need to break down the barriers that you talked about. Now, one of those being broken down is extending what lessons we've learned about defense innovation with DIU in particular to the rest of the world. You mentioned IDEX in India. The UK has its own DIU version, and many other countries are now exploring that. Japan, that's a very positive development. I just a few weeks ago attended a seminar at Stanford, bringing a lot of these defense innovation groups together. What can we learn from each other? So those efforts are very powerful. But we need to be thinking about how do we break down the barriers so that capital, meaning the budgeted dollars, talent, and technology could actually be shared. We're actually not quite as good at that, and that comes from years of not thinking about how do we break down those barriers, but operating in silos that collaborate versus how do we do things jointly. So I would really love to see more. If you thought about projects where we could blend the best of technologies, say from India in the US or Australia in the US, which has strengths in quantum technologies, Japan and materials. How do we think about bringing those together so that you could really blend some budget dollars, some people working together collaboratively, um, and have a defined goal of what you want to deliver that would then be purchased by both militaries and shared with other allies? That's the vision I have of what would make a much stronger defense global ecosystem than what we're relying on today. Immigration is a part of that. We need to make sure we inviting the best from around the world to come and work in our universities and contribute to our economy. I don't feel like our immigration is encouraging that right now. And are we strengthening the university system, which has brought us so many dividends? These are the kind of things we need to think about long term to be able to bring better factors of production that are collaborating across the democratic world to compete with the authoritarian regimes, which have their own closed system, much more top down and directed. I think we got a better system, but we got have to leverage our strengths and make sure they are we're working together with allies and partners to bring the
Yeah, so more
benefits
than
of
the
that to the world.
DIUs and the, let's say, IDEXs of the world and the UK equivalents and Japanese equivalents, do you feel like the venture, again, from a venture capital hat perspective, do you think it's going to be the VC firms either in these countries, either working together, more exchanges, or let's say US VC firms like Shield expanding their scope geographically to go beyond just the US based startups? Um, Joint funds? What are other mechanisms other than, let's say, government to government or defense department to defense department linkages that you feel could accelerate this piece?
Well, I think the role of capital is going to be critically important. Venture capital is very important for a certain type of business, those that would be developing new ideas and new technologies. Private equity is important for the larger businesses. If you're talking about
Yeah.
infrastructure that can be shared, new ports, as an example. So all of the capital actors can play a role here. And the more we allow capital, which historically it's been free to travel and invest in each other, the more benefit we receive from that. So I'm a big believer that we want to be an attractive place for other countries to invest, and we want U.S. capital to go again to friends and allies. I'm not a fan of U.S. investing in Chinese companies that then help the PLA develop, which has been some of the history of our industry, because the only rule has been make money. It's not been think about the world as a much more complex place than we talked about that earlier, than a world is flat and everyone's trading with each other. I wish that were the case, Milton Friedman's previous book, but the world's more complex than that now. So, yes, is the answer to your question. All of the capital actors can play a role here, and there can be collaboration. I don't think that's as big a factor today as it could be. We're not really realizing that potential, as most of the capital actors are focused on what's happening in their own
Yeah,
markets. Some of the short-term policies in Europe have led to the Europeans thinking of the $1 trillion they want to spend in increased defense spending. That needs to be spent locally, because they view the US as a much
I
less
like.
reliable partner after we have, flip-flopped on Ukraine and said some things that were not encouraging at the last Munich Security
Absolutely,
Conference.
absolutely. And to be honest, like if I go back 10, 12 years, even on the internet, consumer internet side, right, I think I saw this trend where US VC firms were largely focused on the domestic US market for a long time, right? Ever since I would say the Silicon, like the boom around the 2000s before the bust, and then subsequently till about 2010, 2012. And I think it's only after that the US VC firms, even accelerators like Y Combinator, start looking out, right? Both for talent, interesting startups, markets, right? And I'm assuming that at some point that trend will pick up
Right.
in the defense tech space as well. Of course, to the exclusion of maybe rivals like China, but at least to friends and allies in Europe, Japan, India, etc. No, this has been fascinating, Michael. I know we are running out of time. I wanted to ask you two questions that I always end our podcast with, which hopefully are simpler than the complex questions we've been working with, uh, better part of the last hour, which are two simple questions. One is, for people interested in the kinds of themes that we've been talking about, that your career has been at the intersection of technology, geopolitics, innovation, venture capital, defense tech. Books that you would recommend for some of our viewers to maybe go read, as well as podcast guests that you would recommend for us to have on.
Well, let's start with some podcast guests. Another couple of fans that I follow closely: Chris Brose, who used to, of course, be the Senate Armed Services Committee director and worked for Senator John McCain. He's now Chief Strategy
Correct.
Officer at Anduril. Uh, Fantastic. Matt Turpin, who I worked with he was the first person I met at the Pentagon back in 2016. And he has gone on from the Joint Staff to being the head of the China desk. So I credit him with a lot of the thought of changing the perspective on China at the beginning of the first Trump administration. He's now spending some time at Palantir. So two friends that I'd highly recommend there. And of course, there's a wealth of talent at some of the think tanks. Paul Shar at CNAS is a friend who would be a
We've had
terrific
Paul.
guest as an example.
We've had Paul in the past. Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. Some of the books, I mean, The Kill Chain by Chris Brose is a phenomenal book. I would also recommend Destined for War, which really Graham Allison talks about the competition with China, although despite the title, really talks about how to avoid war with China. So those are two that come to mind. There's probably more that's being written out about in articles that would be more current than even the books that are out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Including,
Foreign Affairs, War on the Rocks, these are publications I read regularly.
yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll again recommend to our viewers,
So,
I think, your recent pieces in Foreign Affairs, I think, which make a very strong case for the vision you've laid out. So thank you so much.
yeah, that piece, the empty arsenal of democracy, really speaks to how important it is to really be prepared. As we all know, the best way to avoid conflict is to be strong. So that really highlights that. Well, I've really enjoyed being with you on the
No,
podcast,
thank you so
Anirudh.
much
So
for
thank you
taking the
so much
time,
for
Michael.
having
And I
me.
hope we can keep continuing this conversation because I think, as you rightly said, it's a long game, it's a marathon, and maybe no particular end to that marathon, but it's really, I think, also going to be about who keeps adapting, right? The fastest, preparing for the long run, but also keep adapting, because I think the fight is going to be a dynamic one. It's not going to be a static one. So thank you for sharing your insights, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Absolutely.